This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or just people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is an Israeli-American journalist, political scientist and commentator. He's also the author of a new book called The Pater, My Father, My Judaism, My Childlessness, that was recently published in English by Toby Press and is a semi-autobiographical exploration of what it means to be Jewish and childless, an oxymoron of sorts, given that a central commandment is to be fruitful and multiply. Elliot Jager, welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Gilad, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So before we hear your personal story, which is really the crux of the book, I'd like to ask you a more general question by way of introduction. Is childlessness really a particularly Jewish issue? Because having children is a human endeavor, even a biological need. Why is it so central to Judaism, do you think?
I think it's right now we're in the cycle of the reading of the book of Genesis for those people who are in tune with the Torah cycle, and the first several parshiot of the book of Genesis deal very much with childlessness. You know the stories of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and all of those stories are doublets and triplets in a sense that they keep repeating each other. Abraham and Sarah have trouble having children, and then you have the same thing with Jacob and Rachel. For example, and even Isaac and Rebecca, and you have this, and that's the kind of thing that repeats itself throughout the Bible. So, of course, having the issue of having children is universal, but Judaism places a very, very special place on having children and treats not having children as a punishment.
Mm-hmm. And there comes your personal story,
right? We see, Gilad. What I've done is I've written a memoir. It's about growing up fatherless. In a moribund neighborhood, in a very dangerous neighborhood called Alphabet City, which was part of the old Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York. We're talking 1960s, we're talking 1970s. The book is also about father-son relationships. It's not just my relationship with my father, but I also talk to other childless men and talk a little bit about the relationships they have with their father. And it's so my relationship with my father, and you should know that my father and I didn't see each other for 30 years. It's about reconciliation, about relationships. It's a father who obsessed that the son that he himself abandoned when we reconciled, his number one obsession was that I have a child and a son of my own. So it's really the book is a sort of memoir about coming to terms with what life dishes up for you. It's about what it means to be a childless man in Jewish civilization, a civilization that so values making babies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and by the way, we're pro making babies. This is not a sad book. I have to tell you that. This is but the question is, what is the meaning of life without children, and what is this whole issue of tikkun olam, improving the world that you entered, if not by making babies. So that's what we're trying to do.
Do you think that childless Jews are impaired in any sense, imperfect Jews?
Well, that's sort of what we wanted to grapple with, because obviously I don't. I don't think that I'm impaired and I'm as imperfect as the next guy. I'm not worried about being imperfect. But Judaism, if Jewish civilization, the sum total of the civilization, the folklore, the Torah, the Talmud, and whatever stuff we made up along the way, if Jewish civilization places such importance on having children, and not just that, treats not having children as a punishment. And don't forget, it is both an explicit punishment and an inferred punishment. And so, yes, it's pretty important and a pretty strong connection between making babies, but to the question of whether or not life can be fulfilling, one of the things I try to do in the book is talk both to philosophers, to other men, who don't have children and sort of be in touch with my own feelings about. And of course, at the end of the day, we discover that there's a lot of meaning in life with or without children. And of course, many people with children lack meaning in their lives. Mm-hmm. But it's an exploration.
Yeah, exactly. So let's take childlessness apart for a second. What about childlessness as a punishment? I mean, people who really want to have kids and just can't.
Right.
And what about childless people by choice? Right. Where do they all fit together?
Well, it's interesting. There's a lot written about women who've made decisions not to have children, and obviously that's fine with me. I'm not here to run the world. What I'm talking about is I'm doing something that I don't think has ever been done before, which is I'm writing this book from a man's perspective. I don't think any man has ever written a book about what it means to be childless. I don't mean any Jewish man. I mean any man. Now,
because it's
maybe prehistoric man did,
a women's issue in our civilization, right?
But of course it isn't. It's portrayed as a women's issue. So obviously people
and also going back to the Bible, Sarah and Hannah and
right.
Women in the Bible grappled with their childlessness right. much more than men.
Right, not only much more than men, Gilad. But what's interesting is it's as if the men were perfectly virile and just waiting to impregnate them, and my goodness, they just wouldn't get pregnant. Mm-hmm. It's always a woman's problem, right? In the Bible, it's now we can speculate that would be a different story about why
But not just in the Bible, right? Even in the contemporary discourse.
Yes, you often think that there's a problem with the woman, but my book is
and the women think it's a problem with them, right?
yes. Well, listen, look, what I'm really focusing on is people, men and women, obviously, but in my case, men who want to have children, who choose having children, and for whatever reason cannot. So we're not. It's perfectly okay if a man chooses not to have kids. Perfectly okay if a woman chooses not to have kids. But what I was focused on is the men who sort of stumbled into not having children or purposefully didn't have any children, and why that was, and how they got meaning in their lives.
Mm-hmm. And what about you? Do you see your childlessness as perhaps a mirror image of your fatherlessness for many years? Are they complementary?
Well, what's really interesting to me, and the reason really one of the impetus for the book was actually my reconciliation with my father. My father was a Holocaust survivor and had many what we today in contemporary times called issues. You didn't use that term in those days. My father left me twice. Once when I was literally a few months old as an infant, and the second time and permanently when I was about 8 years old. And we didn't see or speak to each other for 30 years. And then when we and I should tell you that my father became he was always Orthodox, but he became a chassid, an ultra-Orthodox Jew, led a very insular life. When we finally reconciled...
after he abandoned you?
30 years later.
Mm-hmm.
No, he had always been Orthodox. He became a chassid still in New York City as he left. And when he left, he came here and he joined a Hasidic world.
Did he start a new family?
He started a new family. But he only had girls.
Well, nobody's perfect. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
So when we reconciled, he took the perspective of, oh my goodness, you need to father a son, because if you don't father a son, who will say Kaddish for you? Mm-hmm. And then you also won't have fulfilled it's a punishment that you don't have children, and it's at least a minor punishment that you don't have a son. So he and I didn't talk about stuff. I didn't say that, we didn't talk about the past. He's a very, very insular, ultra-Orthodox man who's truly spiritual in his own way, not materialistic, and he's only interested in God, in religion, in fearing God, and doing what he thinks God wants him to do. And he kept sending me to this Rebbe, rabbinic holy man, and he sent me to that grave and to that 1-800 number to call, and you can make a deposit, and that will earn you some credits in heaven. And so there was that tension, that constant tension of our reconciliation was overshadowed by his disappointment and his endeavor to move heaven and earth so that I could also have a son.
Mm-hmm. Did you see it as some kind of reconciliation by default? Because it was instrumental at the end of the day. Did you ever suspect the sincerity of his?
No. I never. My father is what you see is what you get. He is he's unbelievable. I've talked to his neighbors. Stop me and say that his neighbors with long beards and peyot and pious looking from head to toe stop me and say, "Oh, your father," and of course they look at me and they say, "You're a bit strange to be this man's son," because I don't look anything like that. But they say to me, "Your father, he's a holy man. I go to him for brachot, for to be blessed." And it's true. It's a hard thing to explain. And one of the things I try to grapple with is how does a guy who abandoned me and I was so angry with for 30 years, he left me. Really, we were indigent on the Lower East, as poor Jews on the Lower East Side, and he went off. And I said, "Well, he never sent a penny." Blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. And so this book is partly a catharsis of my anger towards this man. And the nature of our reconciliation within the confines, within the overarching theme of childlessness.
So you're no longer angry with him?
I'm no longer angry with him. I'm only disappointed that he's a man now in his 90s, very infirm, and I'm only disappointed that till this day we can't have a substantive conversation about why he left. Other than I know that he wanted very much he thought there were also, he wanted to live in the Holy Land. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, the only conversations we can have, and he's quite deaf, pertain to sitting down together, and instead of having a conversation you and I are having, Gilad, what we would do is we simply try to study the Torah or a Mishnah, and that's all we can do. That's our form of communication.
To what extent is your departure from Orthodox Judaism related to your relationship with your father? It's
a hard question. It's another thing that I grapple with in the book. I think I simply, from a very early age, I couldn't buy into. I wanted to. I think I wanted to. I associated orthodoxy with spiritual belief. You see, look, Gilad, there are people around who are outwardly orthodox and behave in an orthodox manner, and yet inside do not necessarily believe what orthodoxy would require of them. I couldn't be that kind of person. So I think, spirituality and having, what I call vitamin G, the God hormone in your brain, is something that you either have or you don't have. You can't force yourself to have it. If I had it, I probably would be more content, because then everything good and bad that happens in life is more easily explained. So I can't say why I left orthodoxy other than it didn't speak to me. I hung on as long as I possibly could. I haven't given up on Judaism or Jewish civilization.
How old were you, by the way, when you gave up on orthodoxy?
Well, it was an incremental process, but I would say that sort of officially, I was probably well into my 30s before I gave up. When I joined a non-Orthodox synagogue. I mean, I guess that was the official.
Not the minute you took off your kippah.
No. That took even longer.
Right.
That took even longer to take off the kippah because, again, but I think that was only possible when I lived in Israel, because in the United States I wanted to be clear that I was Jewish. I think it's very easy to blend in the United States or in England or anywhere else. If you don't wear kippah, you can then kid yourself into thinking that everybody loves you. There's no anti-Semitism. If you wear a kippah, for example, I wore a kippah in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York when I was a kid, then people remind you that you're Jewish.
Yeah, sure. And what about the other childless men you spoke to? Is it for them also an issue that is perhaps subconsciously connected to their relationship with their fathers?
I can't answer that. I talked to such interesting men. Some of them had complicated relationships with their fathers. For example, I spoke to a gay man, and he told me that one of his regrets was that he had a very contentious relationship with his father. And, of course, the underlying reason had to do with his homosexuality and how he thought his father would respond to it. But he never had a chance to tell his father about that. There was another man from Canada whose mother was so overbearing that his father was sort of swept to the side. And he always regretted that he didn't treat his father with respect. So there are all these interesting, complicated relationships. I don't know that you can draw a linear connection between their relationships and their being childless. I mean, sometimes it's just the draw of the cards.
Did you set off trying to establish that and then just saw it's too complicated a picture?
No, I didn't set off to do. The truth is, this book evolved as I wrote it, and I didn't set off to do any one thing. I didn't even know how it would turn out with regard to, even with regard to how I felt about my father. I didn't know. I mean, writing this book actually, and the fact that I now see my father, regularly, has been a catharsis. But no, I didn't. There was no master plan when I started to do this.
And what about really the image of childlessness in Israel today? Do you see a progress over the years? Have we as a society been able to come to terms with it in a much more beneficial way than we used to?
Well, I don't know that we've, as a society, that we're conscious of the issue. First of all, I want to be clear that I want Israelis, if you're listening out there, I want you to go out and make babies. I'm very much happy that Israel's fertility rate is much higher than other Western countries, and that's very important. And
so you still feel that you're, in a way, traitor to the cause because you don't have kids?
Well, I don't know about traitor. Listen, I've given it. Believe me, I have given it, and will continue to give it my best shot. So it's not about that. Right. It's about no. We want Israeli society to keep making more babies, but we would also like, within the subcultures of Israeli society, what I would love to see is just a little bit understanding. Look, we've started to understand, especially now I'm talking about the more traditional world. We've started to be a little bit more empathetic towards gay people in the traditional world. We've started to be a little bit more empathetic towards women who are single women of marriageable age who are not. We started to have some empathy as a collective, right? And all I'm saying now is, especially in the traditional world, that what I'd like to see is a little bit more understanding and empathy for men who don't have children. And understand they're part of that equation, whether they're single men who never married or whatever their circumstances. It would be, for example, in the traditional world, a man is not allowed to lead the services on the high holy days if he doesn't have children. Which is sort of interesting. And yet there are all these great, if I could just, there are all these great famous Jewish men who didn't have children that we all look up to. The traditionalists would look up to Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? Chabad, he didn't have children. Disraeli didn't have children. The Chazon Ish. I mean, you can just keep going. The Satima Rebbe, again from, but of course, Philip Roth. I mean, it all depends. He's still alive. Let him live and be well. But this is not a polemic about what society should do. Right. But if you're asking me, the answer is I'd like a little bit more empathy for people similarly. I'm okay. I'm in a good collective.
Okay, so I'll ask you this. When people ask you, and probably they ask you all the time because, we know what kind of society we live in, when are you going to have children? What do you say?
If they were to ask me now at this stage of the game, when am I going to have children, I would tell them it's unlikely to happen. What you just said is kind of important, and maybe it can sensitize some of our listeners. Sometimes it's well-meaning. Hey, you guys got married. You've been married for 2 or 3 years. Hey, when are you going to have some kids, huh? Mm-hmm. All right. So
we've all heard that.
Now, oftentimes the reason is just good planning, and you don't want to, you want to work on your career.
Or it's none of your damn business.
But you see, you can't really tell somebody it's none of your, unless you want to lose them as your,
I don't mind losing them.
No, I think it was sort of smart, especially it just makes sense to there's a famous rabbi who said, not everything that you think needs to be said out loud, and not everything you say out loud needs to be written down, and not everything you write down needs to be published. And it's very hard for all of us to do any of this. But if we can just think twice before sticking that little probe into somebody and saying, when are you going to have kids, that would be a good beginning.
All right. Elliot Jager, I'm afraid this is all we have time for, but thank you very much for coming in. You're an Israeli-American journalist, political scientist and commentator, and author of the recently published The Pater, My Father, My Judaism, My Childlessness. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Please come over here if you're one of us.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
Trees, storm through the forest. into swamp. Nothing is out there to pull you out. Please come over here if you're one of us. Don't cover your ears if you're one of us. Don't cover your ears if you're one of us. Please come over here if you're one of us. Don't cover your ears if you're one of us. Don't cover your ears if you're one of us. That we're alone. She keeps your tears inside a safe.